In the sun-baked plains of West Texas, a 72-year-old farmer was about to teach a notorious outlaw gang why you should never judge a family by its weathered barn. Thomas Whitaker had spent 4 decades nurturing his heritage pecan orchard in peaceful isolation until the Scorpion Riders motorcycle gang mistook his humble existence for vulnerability. What these violent men didn't know was that his wife Sarah, with her gentle smile and flowing gray hair, had once commanded one of the most elite Delta Force units in American military history. And the tactical nightmare about to unfold would become legend in 3 counties. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitaker farmstead as Thomas eased his aging body from the creaking porch swing, his arthritic hands reaching for the sturdy walking stick he'd carved from pecan wood decades ago. At 72, his shoulders still carried the broad strength of a man who'd worked the land his entire life, though time had etched deep lines into his sun-weathered face and silvered the once dark hair. His eyes, however, remained sharp as a hawk's, taking in every detail of the 120-acre property that had been in his family for 3 generations. The Whitaker farm sat at the junction of 3 counties in a strategically valuable location that straddled one of the few reliable water sources in this drought-prone region of West Texas. The artesian well beneath their property had never run dry, even during the harshest summers, making their land increasingly precious in an era of climate uncertainty. The pecan orchard, with trees planted by Thomas's grandfather, produced some of the most sought-after nuts in the state. Another fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by those with predatory intentions. The first signs of trouble had surfaced about 6 weeks earlier, subtle changes that someone less attuned to their environment might have dismissed. Strange vehicles lingering on the county road, unfamiliar faces asking casual questions at the farmers' market in town, and unusual interest in property boundaries from people claiming to represent agricultural investment groups. But Thomas had spent too many years on this land not to recognize the circling of wolves. He'd mentioned his concerns to Sarah over breakfast one morning, and she'd simply nodded, her blue eyes momentarily hardening with a focus that seemed to extend far beyond their kitchen window. "I'll make some calls," was all she'd said, before returning to her gentle humming as she poured him another cup of coffee. The Whitaker homestead looked like many others in the region, a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a large barn that had been repainted red every 5 years like clockwork, equipment sheds, and the orchard stretching across 60 acres of gently rolling terrain. Nothing about the property suggested anything beyond an ordinary, if well-maintained, family farm. The most remarkable feature to visitors was usually Sarah's extensive garden, which produced vegetables in quantities that seemed almost miraculous given the harsh Texas climate. What wasn't visible to casual observation was the methodical care with which the property had been subtly fortified over the years. The reinforced gate that appeared decorative but could stop a truck, the strategically placed outdoor lighting that eliminated blind spots around the structures, the redundant water systems and generators housed in unassuming outbuildings. To unknowing eyes, these were simply the practical preparations of experienced farmers who understood that self-sufficiency was essential this far from town. To those with trained eyes, however, the property whispered of professional security considerations disguised as rural practicality. Thomas moved carefully down the porch steps, his joints protesting the morning chill that would soon give way to the relentless Texas heat. The pecan orchard stretched before him, trees arranged in precise rows that allowed for efficient harvesting, while also, not incidentally, creating clear lines of sight throughout the property. Sarah had suggested that layout modification 15 years earlier, presenting it as a more efficient approach to cultivation. Only Thomas understood the defensive advantages it also provided. He checked his watch, an old Timex that had survived decades of farm work, noting that Sarah would return from her weekly trip to town in approximately 2 hours. These Tuesday morning drives to purchase supplies and check mail were part of their long-established routine, one that Thomas maintained even when his instincts told him that routine might now be dangerous. Maintaining normalcy was important. Sarah had explained with the quiet authority that occasionally surfaced through her otherwise gentle demeanor. People notice changes in patterns before they notice anything else. Thomas had learned long ago to trust his wife's judgment in matters of security, just as she deferred to his expertise regarding the orchard. Their 43 years of marriage had been built on this mutual respect, each recognizing the other's domains of mastery. To neighbors and the small community 20 miles away in Riverdale, they were simply the quiet Whitaker couple. Him, the knowledgeable pecan farmer, whose advice on cultivation was sought by orchardists across 3 counties. Her, the kind-faced woman who donated extraordinary amounts of produce to the local food bank and taught occasional gardening classes at the community center. Few people knew that Sarah had once been Major Sarah Whitaker, one of the first women to serve in the elite Delta Force with specializations in tactical planning and high-risk extractions. Her 22-year military career had taken her to conflicts that never made the newspapers and operations that remained classified decades later. The gentle hands that now nurtured seedlings in her greenhouse had once coordinated extraction, missions across hostile territories with precision that became training material at Fort Bragg. The soft voice that called Thomas in for dinner had once commanded units of operators through communication systems in conditions where failure meant certain death. Their neighbors saw only her silver-streaked hair, always tied back in a practical braid. Her preference for simple clothing suited to gardening, and her quiet smile. They didn't see the daily training regimen she maintained in the small gym they'd built in the converted attic, or the shooting practice she conducted in the reinforced basement range that appeared on no property plans. Most importantly, they didn't see her network, the men and women scattered across the country who shared her background and with whom she maintained contact through channels that existed outside conventional communications. Thomas continued his morning inspection of the property, a habit formed over decades of agricultural stewardship, but refined under Sarah's subtle guidance to include security considerations that would have seemed paranoid to other farmers. He checked irrigation lines for the expected water output, but also noted their integrity and any signs of tampering. He inspected the perimeter fencing for damage that might affect livestock, but also for indications of intrusion. He tested equipment scheduled for use that day, but also verified that emergency generators were fueled and operational. These dual-purpose inspections had become so natural over the years that Thomas no longer consciously separated agricultural concerns from security ones. Sarah had helped him integrate them seamlessly, presenting each security measure as sensible farm management rather than tactical consideration. A working farm needs reliable backup systems, she'd explained when installing the third redundant power supply. It's just good planning. Thomas paused at the eastern edge of the orchard, squinting against the rising sun to study the county road. A vehicle he didn't recognize had passed by twice in the past 20 minutes. A black SUV with tinted windows that moved too slowly to be simply traveling to a destination. His hand instinctively tightened on his walking stick, though he maintained the unhurried posture of an old farmer enjoying his morning inspection. Inside his pocket, his fingers found the small radio transmitter Sarah had given him years ago, its single button requiring no visual confirmation to activate. He didn't press it yet. Two pass-bys didn't necessarily constitute a threat, and Sarah had trained him to distinguish between heightened awareness and premature reaction. Instead, he changed his inspection route slightly, positioning himself near one of the equipment sheds that offered both cover and access to one of the secure lockboxes installed at strategic points around the property. The peculiar thing about living with someone like Sarah was how her professional paranoia had, over time, come to seem like simple prudence. The concealed weapons caches, the escape routes, the communication protocols, all had been integrated into the rhythm of farm life so gradually that they now seemed as natural as checking weather forecasts before planting. There was comfort in this preparation, Thomas reflected, a security that went beyond physical safety. Sarah had given him the gift of readiness without fear, of vigilance without anxiety. The black SUV appeared again, this time turning onto the long gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse. Thomas observed its approach with the practiced casualness of someone evaluating a potential customer for his pecans, though his mind was calculating distances and timing with a precision Sarah had instilled in him. Three men inside, based on the silhouettes visible through the windshield, moving slowly, not aggressively, but with purpose. Stopping at the exact position that provided them the best view of the main structures while maintaining their fastest exit route. These were not spontaneous behaviors. These were the actions of men who had surveilled the property before, who had planned this approach. Thomas began walking toward the house with the unhurried gait of an old farmer with nowhere particular to be, though his path took him past the equipment shed, where he smoothly retrieved a key from his pocket and unlocked the weathered door. Inside, beneath a workbench that appeared cluttered with ordinary farm maintenance tools, his fingers found the concealed latch that released the lockbox Sarah had installed. The revolver inside was old but meticulously maintained, its weight familiar in his hand as he slipped it into the deep pocket of his work jacket. The men were exiting the vehicle now, three of them, as he'd counted, all wearing dark clothing that might have passed for business casual if not for the two bulky jackets that likely concealed weapons. Their leader, a tall man with a closely trimmed beard and sunglasses despite the early hour, approached with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to getting his way through initial charm, backed by implicit threat. "Mr. Whitaker," the man called out, his voice carrying a forced warmth that didn't reach his hidden eyes. "Beautiful morning for a chat about your property." Thomas continued his unhurried approach, his weathered face arranged in an expression of mild curiosity rather than the alert caution he felt. Sarah had taught him this too, the tactical advantage of being underestimated, of allowing potential threats to believe they faced only an elderly farmer rather than a man prepared by one of the most elite tactical minds in military history. "Don't believe we've had the pleasure," Thomas replied, his Texas drawl perhaps a touch more pronounced than usual, his posture slightly more stooped. "You folks looking to buy some pecans? Won't be harvest for a few months yet." The approaching men exchanged glances that confirmed Thomas's suspicions. They weren't here for pecans. They weren't here for a legitimate business proposal, and most concerning of all, they had timed their visit to coincide with Sarah's regular trip to town, suggesting a level of surveillance that went beyond casual interest. What they didn't know, what Thomas was counting on them not knowing, was that Sarah Whitaker hadn't followed her usual routine that morning. For the first time in nearly 6 months, she had departed from the established pattern they'd maintained so carefully, leaving not for town, but for another destination entirely. This deviation wasn't random, but calculated, triggered by the same observations that had raised Thomas's concerns. And as Thomas prepared to engage these unwelcome visitors with the practiced ease of someone who'd been preparing for this moment, for years, he took comfort in knowing that Sarah's deviation from routine meant something very specific. The contingency plan they had established long ago was already in motion. The three men spread out slightly as they approached, maintaining a triangular formation that Thomas recognized as tactical rather than coincidental. The leader, still wearing that practiced smile, extended his hand as though this were nothing more than a friendly business meeting. "Rick Mercer," he introduced himself, the name sliding off his tongue with practiced ease. "I represent Horizon Development Group. We've been acquiring properties in this region for a special project." His eyes, still hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned the farmhouse and outbuildings with calculated interest. "Your farm has a particular value to our plans." Thomas shook the offered hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent a lifetime working the land, noting the man's soft palm and the expensive watch partially concealed beneath his jacket sleeve. Nothing about him suggested genuine agricultural interest. "Don't recall putting my property up for sale, Mr. Mercer," Thomas replied evenly, his weathered face betraying nothing of his internal assessment. "This land's been in my family going on 100 years now." The two other men had positioned themselves strategically, one angled toward the main access points of the property, the other maintaining line of sight to the road. Their stances suggested military or law enforcement background, though their slightly too long hair and casual dress attempted to disguise this fact. Thomas tallied these observations while maintaining the outward appearance of a simple farmer engaging in unexpected conversation. Mercer's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We understand the sentimental value, sir. That's why Horizon is prepared to offer well above market rate." He reached into his jacket, causing Thomas to subtly shift his weight in preparation, but withdrew only a leather portfolio. "We're talking about a figure that could ensure a very comfortable retirement for you and Mrs. Whitaker." The mention of Sarah's name confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. These men had researched them, observed their routines, and deliberately timed this visit when they believed Thomas would be alone. A normal elderly farmer might have felt fear at this realization. Thomas felt only a grim sense of confirmation and a quiet confidence in the protocols he and Sarah had established years ago. "That's mighty generous," Thomas said, deliberately letting his gaze drift toward the orchard rather than focusing on the document Mercer was now opening. "But like I said, this land isn't for sale, not at any price." Thomas watched Mercer's body. Language shift subtly from confident salesman to something harder, more predatory. The two flanking men adjusted their positions slightly, hands drifting closer to their concealed weapons. The pretense was beginning to fall away. "Mr. Whitaker," Mercer's voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. "I don't think you understand the opportunity here. Horizon has already acquired every surrounding property. Development is moving forward with county approval. Your cooperation would be in everyone's best interest." The threat beneath the polished words was as clear as the Texas sky above them. Thomas had heard similar veiled threats before, from military contractors trying to pressure Sarah into security consulting after her retirement, from developers who'd coveted their water rights during the last drought, from corporate agricultural interests who'd wanted to absorb their organic operation. None had succeeded. "Well now," Thomas drawled, leaning slightly on his walking stick in a posture that suggested age rather than readiness. "Seems like you boys have done your homework on the surrounding properties. But I'm wondering if you've done your homework on mine." Before Mercer could respond, the crunch of gravel announced another vehicle approaching down the long driveway. All four men turned to observe the arrival, a battered pickup truck moving at a deliberate, unhurried pace. Thomas recognized it immediately as belonging to Jake Peterson, who owned the small auto repair shop in Riverdale and had served with Sarah in operations that neither of them ever discussed. Jake's regular Tuesday morning visits to check on Thomas's tractor were part of the security routine Sarah had established years ago, a friendly neighbor stopping by that would appear completely normal to anyone watching the farm. Mercer frowned at the interruption. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, Mr. Whitaker." Thomas allowed a hint of the steel beneath his farmer's demeanor to show through. "On my property, Mr. Mercer. There's no such thing as private conversations with strangers, particularly strangers who come making offers that sound an awful lot like threats." Jake's truck pulled to a stop nearby, and the man himself emerged, a broad-shouldered figure in his 50s, with the practical clothing and calloused hands of someone who worked with machinery daily. Nothing in his friendly wave or relaxed posture would suggest to an untrained observer that he had once been among the most lethal close-quarters combat specialists in Delta Force, or that his arrival at this exact moment was no coincidence. "Morning, Thomas," Jake called out cheerfully. "Thought I'd stop by and take a look at that irrigation pump you mentioned." His sharp eyes took in the three visitors, cataloging details with professional precision, disguised as casual observation. "Didn't know you had company." The subtle repositioning of Mercer's men confirmed Thomas's assessment. They recognized a potential threat in Jake, though they couldn't quite place why the amiable mechanic triggered their tactical awareness. Professional recognizing professional, even when disguised. "These gentlemen were just leaving," Thomas replied, his tone making it clear that the conversation was over. "They made an offer on the farm that I've declined." Jake approached with the easy gait of someone completely comfortable in his surroundings, stopping at a distance that gave him optimal positioning relative to all three visitors. "Property values sure are climbing around here," he observed lightly, though his stance had shifted almost imperceptibly to one that would allow immediate response if needed. "Seems like every month someone's making offers on folks' land." Mercer's cold smile returned as he closed his portfolio. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Whitaker. I suggest you discuss our offer with your wife before making any final decisions. Some opportunities don't come around twice." He handed Thomas a business card with Horizon Development's logo embossed in gold. "We'll give you a few days to reconsider." Thomas accepted the card with weathered fingers that betrayed none of the calculations running through his mind. "My Wife and I have been married 43 years, Mr. Mercer. We don't generally need much discussion to know each other's minds on matters like this. Something in Thomas's steady gaze finally penetrated Mercer's professional facade, causing a flicker of uncertainty. People who were easily intimidated didn't maintain such calm in the face of thinly veiled threats. People who were easily pressured didn't respond with such quiet confidence. The three men retreated to their vehicle with the measured steps of predators temporarily withdrawing rather than defeated. Thomas and Jake remained motionless, watching. As the black SUV reversed and then proceeded down the driveway, dust billowing behind it as it accelerated toward the county road. Only when the vehicle had disappeared from sight did Jake turn to Thomas, his friendly expression replaced by focused professionalism. "Sarah activated the protocol?" Thomas nodded, reaching into his pocket to produce the radio transmitter he'd been prepared to use. "Didn't need to send the alert. She predicted this 3 days ago based on the surveillance pattern. Said they'd make their move when they thought she was in town." "Scorpion Riders," Jake confirmed, his voice hardening. "The development company is just a front. They've been systematically acquiring properties along the county lines, establishing distribution points for their operations. Your water rights and strategic location make this property particularly valuable to them." Thomas's expression remained impassive as he absorbed this information. The name was familiar from news reports. A notorious outlaw motorcycle gang that had evolved from simple criminal activity into a sophisticated organization with business fronts and political connections. Their expansion into this region had been subtle but relentless over the past 2 years. "Sarah's reached out to the network?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer but following their established communication protocol. Jake nodded, his eyes continuously scanning their surroundings with professional vigilance. Phase 1 is already in motion. They'll make a show of leaving the area, try to convince you they've accepted your refusal. Then they'll return, probably after dark, with enough manpower to ensure you can't resist. "Except Sarah won't be coming back from town today," Thomas stated with quiet certainty. "No," Jake confirmed with a grim smile that contained no humor. "She won't." The two men walked toward the barn without further discussion, their pace unhurried but purposeful. To any observer, they would appear to be nothing more than an elderly farmer and his mechanic friend going to check on equipment, not two men. Implementing defensive preparations developed by a master of asymmetric warfare. Inside the barn, Jake helped Thomas move a seemingly immovable storage cabinet, revealing a concealed entrance to a reinforced room built beneath the structure. What appeared from outside to be a simple agricultural barn had been methodically transformed into the centerpiece of a defensive position that could withstand significant assault while appearing completely ordinary. "How long do you estimate?" Thomas asked, as they descended the stairs into the cool, concrete-lined space below. "Based on their usual patterns, they'll wait until around midnight," Jake replied, activating the security system that controlled monitoring devices placed strategically around the property. They'll want to create the impression they've left the area completely before returning in force. The underground room hummed with quiet technology, surveillance monitors showing multiple angles of the property, communication equipment linked to secure channels, and an array of weapons stored in concealed compartments. Nothing about this space suggested the simple farming operation visible above ground. "Sarah estimated we'd have 12 hours from first contact," Thomas noted, checking his watch. "That gives us until approximately 7 p.m. to complete preparations." Before they begin staging their return, Jake nodded, moving to a sophisticated communications console, concealed within what appeared to be ordinary storage shelving. The rest of the team is already on standby. Emily and Marcus are positioned at the highway junction with surveillance equipment. David is coordinating with Ramirez and Chen, who should arrive within the next 4 hours. We'll have 7 operators on site before sunset. Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he surveyed the monitoring screens, each showing the peaceful scenes of his farm from different angles. Nothing in those pastoral images suggested the sophisticated defense system, already activating throughout the property or the elite team, converging on this seemingly unremarkable West Texas pecan farm. They're expecting to find an elderly couple they can easily intimidate, Thomas observed. Not 7 Delta Force operators with a fully prepared defensive position. Jake's answering smile held the cold confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous adversaries in far less favorable conditions. Sarah always did enjoy creating teaching moments, particularly for people who mistake gray hair for vulnerability. Thomas moved to a secure cabinet and retrieved a satellite phone, not the kind available to civilians, but a military-grade secure communications device that Sarah had somehow forgotten to return after her retirement. He dialed a number from memory and waited only a moment before a familiar voice answered. "Right on schedule," Sarah Whitaker said, her tone warm but focused. "I'm guessing our visitors have made their first approach and departed, just as you predicted," Thomas confirmed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the sound of his wife's voice. Horizon Development Group, represented by a man calling himself Rick Mercer. 3-man team, professionally trained, trying to pass as businessmen, but definitely scorpion riders in forces. "Rick Mercer," Sarah repeated, and Thomas could hear the sound of computer keys in the background. "Real name Richard Mercer Dominguez, former private military contractor with a specialty in asset acquisition through forced sales. He's their negotiator for high-value targets." Thomas couldn't help the pride that swelled in his chest, even after all these years. While he'd been observing 3 men making thinly veiled threats, Sarah had already identified them and was assembling complete intelligence profiles on their operation. "They're planning to return after dark," Thomas informed her, though he suspected she already knew this. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "They'll bring approximately 20 operators, believing that's sufficient to overwhelm an elderly couple. Team 2 is tracking their preparations at the abandoned Wilson property. They're staging equipment there, thinking it's outside our awareness radius." The casual confidence in her voice reminded Thomas of why Sarah had risen to command elite units despite the obstacles faced by women in special operations. Her ability to predict adversaries' movements and prepare countermeasures that anticipated multiple contingencies had made her legendary among those few who knew of her classified operations. "When will you return?" Thomas asked, knowing the answer would depend on operational considerations rather than personal preference. "I'll remain at the command post until Phase 2 is complete," Sarah replied. "The Scorpion Riders have connections in local law enforcement, so we need to ensure everything is properly documented from a legally defensible position. Jake has operational command on site until I arrive." Thomas nodded, understanding the necessity, though he would have preferred having Sarah beside him. After 43 years of marriage, 22 of which she had spent on classified operations around the world, he had learned to trust her judgment implicitly. "I've got your favorite pecan pie waiting when this is over," he said, their long-established code for "be careful and come home safe." Her soft chuckle warmed him even through the secure connection. "I'm counting on it. Network communications from now until completion. I love you, Thomas." "Love you too," he replied before ending the connection according to protocol. Thomas turned to find Jake already engaged in final equipment checks, his movements displaying the efficient precision of someone who had performed similar preparations countless times in far more hostile environments. The monitors showed no activity on the property, but both men knew that would change dramatically. In the coming hours, they have no idea what they're walking into, Jake commented, his voice containing a hint of professional satisfaction. Thomas's weathered face settled into determined lines as he took his position at the communications station. Sarah always said the most dangerous mistake in tactical operations is underestimating your opponent based on appearances. Outside, the Texas sun continued its arc across the clear blue sky, illuminating a peaceful pecan orchard that would soon become a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, orchestrated by a woman whose lifetime of elite military service remained hidden behind the gentle smile of a farmer's wife. At least until tonight. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. If this tale of hidden strength and tactical brilliance resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have something extraordinary prepared just for our loyal viewers. A special breakdown of how elite operators think in crisis situations that you won't want to miss. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the Whitaker farm as Thomas and Jake continued their preparations with methodical precision. To any casual observer passing on the county road, the scene would appear completely ordinary. An elderly farmer and his friend performing routine maintenance around the property. Nothing in their unhurried movements or relaxed postures would suggest they were systematically activating one of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever installed on private property. "South Quadrant sensors are online," Jake reported, his hands covered in dirt from where he'd been seemingly adjusting irrigation equipment while actually activating ground-based motion and heat sensors disguised as ordinary agricultural implements. Driveway pressure plates are active and calibrated for vehicle weight classification. Thomas nodded, continuing his work on what appeared to be a simple control panel for the orchard's irrigation system. In reality, he was programming automated response sequences that would allow them to control water pressure throughout the property, a capability that could be used for everything from creating obscuring mist to deploying emergency fire suppression. "Greenhouse. Measures complete," he confirmed, carefully closing the panel and wiping his hands on a bandana. Sarah's garden defenses are operational. What looked like an ordinary hobby greenhouse, filled with Sarah's prized tomatoes and peppers, concealed one of their most sophisticated defensive positions, a reinforced structure with ballistic glass disguised as ordinary greenhouse panels, equipped with surveillance systems and emergency supplies. The lush vegetation provided perfect concealment for equipment that would seem completely out of place on a family farm. As the afternoon progressed, 4 more vehicles arrived at staggered intervals. Ordinary trucks and cars that wouldn't draw. Attention in rural Texas. Their drivers, men and women of various ages, appeared to be nothing more remarkable than friends stopping by to help an elderly neighbor with farm chores. No one watching would connect the middle-aged woman in gardening clothes, the young man in a university agriculture department t-shirt, or the retired-looking couple with the extensive equipment cases disguised as farming supplies they unloaded? Emily. Chen, who arrived looking like any other agricultural extension advisor in her khaki pants and practical boots, had actually served as Sarah's communications specialist during 3 high-risk operations in regions that didn't officially have American military presence. Her unassuming appearance and warm smile disguised an expertise in tactical communications that had once coordinated simultaneous extraction operations under enemy fire. "Perimeter monitoring is live," she reported quietly as she helped Thomas carry what appeared to be seed trays toward the greenhouse. "We've established a surveillance radius of 2 miles on all approach vectors. Satellite uplink is secure and Sarah has full visual access." Marcus Ramirez, whose university t-shirt and easygoing manner suggested a graduate student rather than a former Delta Force weapons specialist, busied himself with apparently routine maintenance on farm equipment in the main barn. His skilled hands moved with practiced efficiency as he verified weapons placements and ammunition supplies concealed within ordinary-looking farm implements. "Main defensive positions are prepped," he confirmed when Thomas joined him in the barn. "Primary and secondary fallback points are stocked and ready. We've updated the response protocols based on Sarah's assessment of their likely approach." Tactics? David Winters and his wife Carolyn, who arrived in a camper that suggested retired tourists, had both served under Sarah's command during operations that remained classified 20 years later. While they appeared to be nothing more than an older couple helping with gardening and property maintenance, they were actually establishing sniper positions disguised as ordinary farm features and placing non-lethal countermeasures at strategic points throughout the property. "East and west overwatch positions are established," David reported, his weathered face showing nothing but friendly concern as he shared a glass of lemonade with Thomas on the porch, a position that gave them clear visual coverage of the main approach road. Carolyn has completed the greenhouse armament installation. Medical station is prepped for contingencies. As the team continued its preparations, Thomas received regular updates from Sarah via their secure communication system. Her years of intelligence work were evident in the detailed assessment she provided of the Scorpion Rider's capabilities and likely tactics. Thermal imaging confirms 23 individuals at the staging area, her calm voice reported. They've brought 4 vehicles plus motorcycles, standard armament for their operations, primarily semi-automatic weapons, body armor, and flashbang grenades. Their communications indicate they believe this will be a simple intimidation operation against isolated civilians. Thomas couldn't help the grim smile that crossed his face. "Any indication they've recognized our preparations?" "Negative," Sarah replied. "Their surveillance has been superficial, periodic drive-bys and long-distance observation. They've completely missed our security measures and the arrival of our team. Overconfidence is working in our favor." The team gathered for a final briefing as evening approached, meeting in the reinforced basement beneath the barn, where they could speak freely without concern for surveillance. The space looked like an ordinary root cellar for storing the farm's pecan harvest, but contained communications equipment, tactical displays, and medical supplies that would be at home in a military command center. Emily had established a secure connection with Sarah, whose image appeared on a monitor mounted on the wall. Despite being in her late 60s, Sarah Whitaker's appearance commanded immediate respect, her silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, her blue eyes sharp and focused, her posture reflecting decades of military discipline now turned to the protection of her home and husband. Based on their communications and movement patterns, we've identified their operational plan, Sarah began without preamble. They intend to surround the property at approximately 0100 hours, cut power and communications, and then approach the house from multiple vectors. Their goal is to isolate and intimidate, not to engage in prolonged confrontation. Thomas watched. His wife, with the pride and admiration that had only deepened over their decades together. In these moments, when her natural command presence emerged, he could see the officer who had led elite teams through operations so dangerous and sensitive they would never be acknowledged. Their profile indicates they avoid direct confrontation with law enforcement and prefer to operate through intimidation rather than open violence, Sarah continued. However, they've displayed increasing willingness to escalate force when they believe they face minimal risk or consequences. She manipulated something off-screen, and the display changed to show satellite imagery of the farm with tactical overlays indicating approach vectors and defensive positions. Our objective is containment and documentation, not engagement, she emphasized. We want irrefutable evidence of their illegal activities that can be provided to federal authorities. The local sheriff's department has been compromised. 3 deputies are on the Scorpion Riders' payroll, which is why we're handling this privately. Each team member nodded in understanding. This wasn't about revenge or confrontation. It was about gathering evidence and protecting the farm while ensuring the Scorpion Riders faced appropriate legal consequences for their attempted intimidation. Thomas will maintain command of the central position from the house, Sarah continued. Jake has tactical lead for field operations. Emily will coordinate communications and surveillance. Marcus, David, and Carolyn will maintain perimeter security and response capability. Your specific positions and protocols are in your briefing packages. Her expression softened slightly as she addressed her husband directly. Thomas, the greenhouse secure room is prepared if you need to withdraw to a more defensible position. Thomas met her gaze steadily. I'll maintain primary position at the house as planned. They need to see the old farmer they think is an easy target. Sarah's slight smile acknowledged his stubbornness with the familiarity of long marriage. Just remember your extraction protocols if the situation changes. No unnecessary risks. As the team reviewed final positions and communications protocols, Thomas felt the familiar calm that preceded operations. A state of heightened awareness combined with complete confidence in preparation and team capability. It was a feeling he'd first experienced decades ago when Sarah would prepare for deployment, and one he'd come to recognize in himself during the security drills she'd insisted they practice throughout their marriage. One final note, Sarah added, as the briefing concluded. We've confirmed that Richard Mercer Dominguez is personally leading this operation. His profile indicates a history of violence disproportionate to operational requirements. Consider him individually dangerous and potentially unstable if his plans are disrupted. The warning needed no elaboration. Everyone present understood that while most of the Scorpion Riders would likely retreat when faced with unexpected resistance, their leader might escalate unpredictably if his authority or control were threatened. As the team dispersed to their assigned positions, Thomas lingered to speak privately with Sarah through the secure connection. For a moment, the commander receded, and he saw only his wife's face, lined with years but still beautiful to him, her eyes warming as they focused solely on him. "I should be there with you," she said quietly. A rare admission of personal preference. "Over tactical necessity, you're exactly where you need to be," Thomas replied, with the certainty of absolute trust. "Besides, we've been preparing for something like this for years. Time to put all that training to use." Sarah's smile held equal parts affection and pride. "You've become quite the tactician, Mr. Whitaker. Sometimes I forget you were just a simple pecan farmer when we met. And you were just as tough as nails. Army officer who didn't know an irrigation system from a tractor," he countered, with the easy banter of long marriage. "We've taught each other a few things over the years." Their moment of connection was brief but powerful, a reminder of the partnership that had sustained them through decades of challenges, both ordinary and extraordinary. "Network communication protocols from now until completion," Sarah said, returning. "To operational mode. I'll see you at sunrise, Thomas." "Count on it," he replied, before the connection ended. As Thomas climbed the stairs from the underground command center, he found Jake waiting for him near the barn entrance, his expression reflective in the fading light. "You know, when Sarah first reached out to us about setting up this security system years ago, I thought she was being paranoid," Jake admitted. "Spent 20 years in the most dangerous places on Earth without a scratch, then comes home to worry about defending a pecan farm in Texas." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Sarah always said the most dangerous threats are the ones you don't take seriously until they're at your door. She spent her career planning for worst-case scenarios, so they never happened." Jake's expression shifted to one of professional appreciation. "Well, the Scorpion Riders are about to learn they picked the wrong, defenseless elderly couple to intimidate. Sarah's turned this farm into a tactical masterpiece without anyone ever noticing." The sunset painted the pecan orchard in golden light as the two men walked toward the farmhouse, their casual postures belying the heightened state of readiness shared by everyone on the property. To the west, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rain before morning. "Appropriate weather for what's coming," Thomas observed, his experienced farmer's eye assessing the approaching system. "Sarah always did like operating in the rain. Says it masks movement and sound." Jake chuckled softly. "Some people never really retire. They just find new theaters of operation." As darkness began to fall across the Whitaker farm, final preparations were completed with quiet efficiency. Lights were left on in patterns that suggested normal evening activities in the house. Thomas moved between windows occasionally, maintaining the appearance of an elderly farmer going about his evening routine. To any watching eyes, nothing would appear unusual or concerning. What those watching eyes couldn't see was the symphony of defensive measures now fully activated throughout the property. Motion sensors disguised as irrigation equipment, cameras hidden in birdhouses and garden ornaments, pressure plates beneath the gravel driveway, and infrared monitoring systems concealed in ordinary farm fixtures. Thomas settled into his rocking chair on the front porch, a shotgun resting openly. Across his lap, exactly what would be expected of an elderly farmer who had received threatening visitors earlier in the day. The weapon was real, but it was hardly the most effective defensive option now available to him. As he rocked slowly, in the gathering darkness, seeming to all observers like a vulnerable old man stubbornly guarding his home, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. The Scorpion Riders thought they were surrounding an isolated, defenseless elderly couple. In reality, They were walking into a carefully orchestrated operation designed by one of the most brilliant tactical minds ever to serve in Delta Force. The coming hours would teach them a lesson about appearances and assumptions, one they would not soon forget. The first raindrops fell just after 10 o'clock, pattering against the tin roof of the farmhouse with increasing intensity as the storm front moved across the West Texas landscape. Thomas remained on the porch for another half hour, maintaining the image of a stubborn old farmer, before finally rising with exaggerated stiffness and heading inside. The shotgun remained prominently visible as he moved between windows, creating the silhouette of a man preparing to defend his home with limited resources. Below the ordinary farmhouse exterior, however, the Whitaker home had been subtly transformed. What appeared to be simple wooden floors concealed pressure sensors that tracked movement throughout the structure. Ordinary-looking electrical outlets housed surveillance cameras and acoustic monitoring devices. The vintage ham radio set in. Thomas's study was actually a sophisticated communication system linked to the team's secure network. Thomas made his way to the kitchen, where he set about making coffee with methodical precision, the familiar ritual calming as the waiting continued. The kitchen windows, which appeared to be original to the 100-year-old farmhouse, had been replaced years ago with impact-resistant glass in frames reinforced to withstand significant force. The quaint farmhouse curtains concealed quick deploy. Ballistic shields that could cover the windows in seconds if needed. Status update. Thomas spoke quietly, seemingly to himself as he measured coffee grounds. Emily's voice responded immediately through the communication device disguised as a hearing aid in Thomas's ear. All systems operational. Rain is degrading their thermal imaging capabilities as expected. We've confirmed movement at their staging area. They're beginning preliminary deployment. Estimated time to property perimeter is approximately 90 minutes, Thomas acknowledged with a soft tap on the counter, a signal recognized by the acoustic monitors, and continued his coffee preparation. The familiar domestic task centered him, while his mind processed tactical considerations with the disciplined focus Sarah had helped him develop over decades of marriage to one of America's most elite operators. In the barn, Jake supervised final equipment checks as the team prepared for the approaching confrontation. Their positions had been carefully selected to create overlapping fields of observation while remaining completely concealed from conventional surveillance. Marcus had established himself in the equipment shed with access to non-lethal countermeasures disguised as ordinary farm tools. David and Carolyn maintained positions in the orchard's irrigation control stations, ordinary-looking structures that provided excellent visibility across the property's southern approach. Thomas, we have movement on the county road, Emily reported at 11:23 p.m. 2 vehicles passing without stopping, conducting final reconnaissance before main approach. Sarah confirms these are consistent with Scorpion Rider's advanced team protocols. The rain had intensified to a steady downpour, reducing visibility and creating background noise that would mask movement across the property. Lightning occasionally illuminated the landscape in stark white flashes, followed by rolling thunder that would help conceal any sounds of the team repositioning as needed. Perfect conditions, came Sarah's voice through the communication system, briefly patched in from her remote command position. They'll rely on numbers and intimidation rather than precision in this weather. Standard approach vector confirmed. They'll Establish perimeter positions before cutting power to the property. Thomas moved through the house with practiced ease, despite the dimmed lights, checking window positions and confirming access to the concealed equipment caches positioned throughout the structure. To outward appearances, he was simply an elderly man securing his home before bed. In reality, he was preparing multiple response options depending on how the Scorpion riders chose to approach. At precisely midnight, the property's power went out, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The farmhouse was plunged into darkness, though emergency lighting softly illuminated key areas through what would appear to be battery-operated lamps, typical in rural homes prone to power outages. Thomas activated a small generator on the back, a porch creating the expected response of a prepared but conventional homeowner. Grid power cut at junction box on eastern property line, Emily confirmed, switching to internal power systems. All surveillance and defensive systems remain operational on independent circuits. Thomas acknowledged and moved to his predetermined position in the living room, settling into his armchair with the shotgun across his lap, the very picture of an old farmer waiting for trouble. The raindrops drumming against the windows provided a steady backdrop as the team communicated in brief, efficient exchanges through their secure network. 8 individuals approaching through the orchard from the south, Marcus reported. Standard tactical spacing, armed, using tree lines for cover. 4 more approaching from the east along the equipment access road, added David. 2 vehicles holding position at the county road junction with engines running, likely extraction. In contingency, Thomas remained motionless in his chair as Emily's voice provided continuous updates. Lead elements approaching outbuildings. Thermal signatures confirm 12 individuals now on property, with more staging at the perimeter. Primary target identified. Mercer is with the Eastern Approach Group. The tactical situation was unfolding exactly as Sarah had anticipated in her briefing. The Scorpion riders were implementing a standard intimidation operation surrounding the property, cutting utilities, and then converging on the house to force submission through overwhelming numbers. They had no way of knowing that their movements were being tracked with military precision, their tactical formations analyzed, and their vulnerabilities identified by experts in counterinsurgency operations. At 12:17 a.m., a beam of light swept across the front windows of the farmhouse as the first group of Scorpion riders approached the main structure. Thomas remained seated, presenting the expected image of an elderly homeowner nervously awaiting intruders. The shotgun rested visibly across his lap, a conventional defense that the approaching gang members would have anticipated and prepared for. Front porch, 3 individuals, Emily narrated calmly in Thomas's ear. Rear approach, 2 more. Side, entries covered, they're establishing containment before initiating contact. Thomas's breathing remained steady as he heard footsteps on the porch. The weathered boards creaked under the weight of multiple people attempting to move quietly despite the rain. A powerful flashlight beam swept through the windows again, briefly, illuminating Thomas in his chair before continuing its survey of the room. The expected knock came at 12:23 a.m. 3 sharp raps that carried authority rather than request. Thomas didn't immediately respond, following the protocols Sarah had established for this scenario. Make them work for every interaction. Increase their uncertainty with each passing moment. The knocking came again, harder this time, accompanied by a voice attempting to project both authority and reasonable concern. Mr. Whitaker. This is Rick Mercer. We spoke earlier today. I'm concerned about your safety out here. With the power out in this storm, may I come in to discuss our proposal? The false solicitude in the man's voice would have been convincing to someone unused to deception. Thomas, with 4 decades of experience reading the subtleties in Sarah's expressions when she couldn't discuss classified operations, recognized the predatory anticipation beneath the professional tone. Thomas responded exactly as an isolated, nervous elderly man might, with gruff suspicion rather than immediate compliance. It's after midnight, Mr. Mercer. Decent folks don't conduct business at this hour. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear Sarah's soft chuckle of approval at his performance. The team maintained absolute silence in their concealed positions around the property, monitoring the Scorpion Rider's movements with professional precision. "I apologize for the late hour," Mercer called through the door. The veneer of professionalism still intact, though wearing thinner. "But after our conversation today, I received authorization for an even more generous offer. Given the storm and power outage, I thought you might appreciate knowing there's a better option available to you." Thomas allowed the appropriate pause, long enough to suggest an old man considering his limited options, not so long as to provoke immediate aggression. "My wife isn't home," he finally responded, introducing the element that Mercer would have expected based on their surveillance of Sarah's regular Tuesday trips to town. "I don't make decisions like this without her." Through the conversation, Thomas was receiving continuous updates from the team about positioning and movements around the property. The Scorpion Riders had established a complete perimeter, with armed individuals covering all potential exit points from the main structures. They believed they had achieved complete tactical control of the situation, a misconception the team was carefully nurturing. "I understand completely," Mercer replied, his voice recalibrating to sympathetic persuasion. "Family decisions should include all parties. Perhaps I could come in out of this rain and we could call Mrs. Whitaker to discuss the offer together." Was a clumsy attempt to gain entry while appearing reasonable. Exactly the approach Sarah had predicted from an organization that relied on intimidation rather than sophistication. Thomas's continued resistance would provide the pretext for escalation that Mercer needed to justify more aggressive measures. "Phone lines must be down with the power," Thomas responded, introducing another expected complication. "And I don't open my door to uninvited visitors at night. You can come back tomorrow during daylight hours." The silence that followed lasted 12 seconds. Thomas counted each one, tracking the increasing tension as Mercer's patience eroded. When the response came, the false congeniality had hardened into something closer to the man's true nature. "Mr. Whitaker, I don't think you understand your situation. We've made a very generous offer, but our patience has limits. It would be unfortunate if this beautiful farm suffered damage in this storm because you refused reasonable discussion." The threat was now explicit, exactly what the team had been waiting for. Every word was being recorded through multiple systems, building the evidence package that would eventually be delivered to federal authorities. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Mercer?" Thomas demanded, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of an honest citizen confronted with criminal intimidation. "Not at all," Mercer replied smoothly. "I'm simply concerned about various risks to isolated properties like yours. Fire, vandalism, accidents. Rural areas see all kinds of misfortunes. The right business partners can provide valuable protection." Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear Sarah's voice, calm and focused, as she directed the operation from her remote position. "Excellent, Thomas. We have explicit extortion on record now. Maintain current approach. Force him to escalate further before we initiate countermeasures." Thomas shifted audibly in his chair, creating the impression of an old man growing increasingly nervous. "You and your men need to leave my property right now. I've called the sheriff already." This false claim was a calculated move, one that would force Mercer to reveal his confidence in having compromised local law enforcement. The response was immediate and revealing. "No need to involve Sheriff Daniels in a simple business discussion," Mercer said with renewed confidence. "He and I have an understanding about development matters in this county. He won't be responding to calls from this address tonight." Another piece of evidence secured: confirmation of corruption in local law enforcement, recorded and documented for federal prosecution. "I'm not opening this door," Thomas insisted, maintaining his role as a stubborn but increasingly frightened old farmer. "You need to leave now." The pretense of civility finally collapsed completely as Mercer's voice hardened into open threat. "Mr. Whitaker, we're coming inside to discuss this offer, whether you open the door or not. How that happens is entirely your choice, but it will happen. You have 30 seconds to make this easy on yourself." In his earpiece, Thomas heard Sarah's calm command: "All units prepare for Phase 2. Thomas, initiate countdown protocol." As Mercer began audibly counting down from 30 outside the door, Thomas activated the sequence they had prepared for this moment. To the watching Scorpion riders, the old farmer appeared to be making a panicked call on an ancient rotary phone in the corner, exactly the desperate, futile gesture they would have expected. What they couldn't see was that Thomas was actually activating the property's full defensive protocols while maintaining the appearance of a vulnerable, frightened old man with no real options. As Mercer's countdown reached 5, the trap was fully set. "Time's up, Mr. Whitaker," Mercer announced with cold finality. "We're coming in now. How difficult this gets is entirely up to you." Thomas settled back into his chair, shotgun across, his lap presenting the image of a terrified but defiant old man preparing for his last stand. As the door lock began to splinter under the first impact of a battering ram, his finger pressed the small transmitter in his pocket, the final signal that would initiate the response the Scorpion riders never expected and would never forget. The farmhouse door exploded inward with a splintering crash, rain and wind gusting through the opening as 3 silhouetted figures burst into the dimly lit living room. Their tactical flashlights swept across the space, powerful beams converging on Thomas in his chair, momentarily blinding him with their intensity. Behind these lead elements, Mercer stepped through the shattered doorway with the confident stride of someone who believed victory was already secured. "Mr. Whitaker," he announced, water dripping from his expensive jacket onto the worn hardwood floor. "It seems we'll be having our discussion after all." Thomas squinted against the harsh light, maintaining his performance as a frightened elderly man while quietly pressing the second transmitter button in his pocket, the signal that intruders had breached the main structure. Through his earpiece, he could hear the calm, professional responses of the team, acknowledging his signal and preparing to implement Phase 2 of Sarah's meticulously designed operation. "You're trespassing," Thomas stated, his weathered hands steady on the shotgun across his lap. "Breaking and entering, threatening a private citizen in his home. You won't get away with this." Mercer's laugh held genuine amusement as he gestured for his men to secure the room. Mr. Whitaker, I think you're failing to grasp the situation. There are no witnesses here except my associates. The local authorities won't be responding, and by morning, you'll have either accepted our very generous offer or suffered an unfortunate accident during this terrible storm. As Mercer spoke, his men moved with practiced efficiency to establish control of the farmhouse interior. Two secured the front entrance, while others moved toward the kitchen and hallway leading to the bedrooms. Their movements revealed professional training, not military precision, but the practiced coordination of experienced criminals who had conducted similar operations many times before. What they failed to notice, however, were the subtle defensive measures activating throughout the structure. As they crossed specific pressure points built into the flooring, silent signals transmitted their positions to the team's monitoring systems. When their flashlights swept across seemingly ordinary fixtures, specialized sensors cataloged their weapons and equipment. Every word was being recorded by multiple redundant systems concealed throughout the room. Thomas maintained eye contact with Mercer, playing the role of the defiant but outmatched old farmer, while providing the distraction needed for these automated systems to complete their documentation. The longer he kept their attention focused on him, the more comprehensive the evidence package would become. "Where is your wife, Mr. Whitaker?" Mercer asked, glancing at his watch with theatrical impatience. "Our information suggested she should have returned from town hours ago." Thomas allowed a flicker of genuine concern to show on his face, a calculated response that would reinforce their misconception about Sarah's whereabouts and capabilities. "She's staying with her sister in Riverdale tonight because of the storm. Called me just before the power went out." The lie was perfect for this moment, plausible enough to be believed while introducing uncertainty into the Scorpion Riders' operational planning. They had based their approach on the assumption that they would be dealing with an elderly couple, not just Thomas alone. This small change to their expected scenario would force them to adapt, creating opportunities for mistakes. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear Sarah's approving voice. "Excellent misdirection." Their communications just spiked with uncertainty. "Maintain current posture while we position for Phase 2 initiation." Mercer frowned slightly at this unexpected development before smoothing his expression back to confident control. "Then we'll proceed with just you for now. My associates will ensure we're not interrupted while we review our proposal." On cue, one of the men near the kitchen called out, "House is secure, boss. No one else present. All exits covered." Another man, bulkier than the others with a shaved head and multiple tattoos visible beneath his rain-soaked jacket, approached Thomas with predatory focus. "Want me to secure the old man?" Mercer considered Thomas for a moment, assessing the shotgun and the elderly farmer's defensive posture. "Mr. Whitaker, that shotgun is creating an unnecessary tension in our discussion. I suggest you set it aside so we can talk like reasonable businessmen." Thomas tightened his grip slightly on the weapon, his expression hardening into stubborn resistance. "This is my home. You broke in. I'm within my rights to defend myself." The calculated defiance produced exactly the response Sarah had predicted. Mercer nodded to the tattooed man, who moved toward Thomas with the confident stride of someone accustomed to physically dominating others. As he reached for the shotgun, Thomas allowed him to grasp the barrel, maintaining his grip on the stock. In apparent stubborn resistance, "Let it go, old man," the tattooed intruder growled, pulling the weapon from Thomas's hands with deliberate force intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The moment the shotgun left Thomas's possession, multiple systems activated simultaneously throughout the property. The farmhouse lights suddenly blazed to life. Not the expected warm yellow of residential lighting, but harsh, disorienting blue-white illumination that momentarily stunned the unprepared intruders. A series of loud mechanical clicks echoed through. The structure of specialized locks engaged on all windows and exterior doors, securing the building more effectively than any conventional system. Most shocking to the Scorpion Riders, however, was the sudden voice that filled the room. Not from any visible speaker, but seemingly from the walls themselves. Sarah Whitaker's tone carried the unmistakable authority of command as she addressed the intruders directly. Attention, unauthorized individuals inside the Whitaker residence. You are currently being recorded by multiple systems. Your vehicles have been disabled. Your communications are being jammed. You have exactly 60 seconds to place any weapons on the floor and assume a non-threatening posture. The professional calm in her voice was more unnerving than any shouted threat could have been. This wasn't the panicked response of civilians being victimized. It was the measured protocol of someone who had controlled far more dangerous situations. Mercer's expression transformed from confident control to wary reassessment as he scanned the room for the source of the voice. His men had instinctively drawn weapons at the sudden changes, their tactical formation tightening around their leader as they tried to identify the nature of the threat. "What is this?" Mercer demanded, directing his question at Thomas. "Some kind of security system? It won't matter. Your rural alarm monitoring can't get anyone here in time to help you." Thomas remained seated, his posture relaxing now that the performance of vulnerable old farmer was no longer necessary. The slight smile that crossed his weathered face carried decades of shared secrets with the woman whose voice had just shattered the Scorpion Rider's confidence. "That's not an alarm system, Mr. Mercer," Thomas explained with calm satisfaction. "That's my wife." Outside the farmhouse, Phase 2 of Sarah's operation was unfolding with military precision. The team had allowed the Scorpion Riders to establish what they believed was tactical control of the property, creating a false sense of security while documenting their illegal activities. Now, with the intruders contained inside the farmhouse, the team began systematically neutralizing the exterior elements of the criminal force. Jake's voice provided continuous updates through the communication system as his team implemented Sarah's carefully designed protocols. East Perimeter Team neutralized with non-lethal measures, 2 subjects secured. West Approach Team attempting retreat, but contained by activated barriers. Vehicles at Road Junction disabled via remote immobilization. The irrigation equipment positioned throughout the orchard had deployed specialized netting and targeted disorientation measures, capturing the Scorpion Riders' perimeter teams without injury, but with complete effectiveness. The mechanical problems suddenly affecting their vehicles were actually the result of specialized electromagnetic pulses delivered by devices concealed in ordinary-looking fence posts at the property boundaries. Inside the farmhouse, the tattooed man who had taken Thomas's shotgun discovered too late that the weapon had been modified. The firing pin removed and a specialized dye pack installed in the stock that now covered his hands with an indelible ultraviolet reactive compound impossible to remove for at least 48 hours. Evidence of his direct involvement now literally stained his skin, documented by the comprehensive recording systems throughout the room. 45 seconds remaining, Sarah's voice announced, with the same professional calm. "Be advised, that non-compliance will result in the deployment of incapacitating measures. The Scorpion Riders' confident operation was unraveling with astonishing speed. Their communications equipment produced only static, preventing coordination with their exterior teams. The weapons they had expected to provide overwhelming force against an elderly couple now seemed inadequate. Against an unseen but clearly professional opposition, Mercer's expression had transformed from confident control to calculating assessment as he tried to determine the nature and extent of the trap they had walked into. His eyes darted around the room, searching for cameras, speakers, any technology that might explain what was happening. "Who are you people?" he demanded, directing his question at Thomas, but clearly addressing whoever was controlling the situation. Thomas's smile widened slightly. "Just a pecan farmer and his wife, protecting what's theirs. Though I suppose Sarah did bring some skills. And from her previous career, the casual revelation dropped like a stone into the tense atmosphere of the room. One of Mercer's men, apparently with some military background, made the connection first. "Boss," he said, his voice tight with new concern, "check the photos on the shelf behind him." All eyes turned to the family photographs displayed on the old wooden bookcase. Among the expected images of farm life and family gatherings were several framed photographs that had been dismissed during their initial surveillance as insignificant. Now, with new context, these images told a very different story. Sarah Whitaker in military uniform, receiving commendations, standing with elite units whose insignia had been deliberately positioned to be visible in the frame, shaking hands with high-ranking officers whose faces would be recognized by anyone with sufficient military knowledge. "Delta Force," the same man whispered, recognition and new respect evident in his voice. "The old lady is fucking Delta Force." Mercer's face hardened as he reassessed the situation with this new information. His hand moved toward the concealed weapon in his jacket as he made a rapid tactical decision. If they were being recorded, as claimed, escalating to deadly force would significantly increase their legal jeopardy. However, if they could neutralize Thomas and escape, they might be able to contain the situation. 30 seconds remaining, Sarah's voice announced. The professional calm unchanged despite the escalating tension. Mercer made his decision, drawing his weapon with practiced speed and aiming directly at Thomas. "New negotiation," he announced, all pretense of business discussion abandoned. "We're leaving with the old man as insurance. Anyone interferes, he dies. Once we're clear of the property, we'll release him unharmed." Thomas remained perfectly still, his expression showing neither fear nor concern as the weapon pointed at his chest. His decades with Sarah had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine tactical leverage and desperate bluffing. Mercer's hostage strategy might have been effective against conventional opposition, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were facing. "That's not how this works," Thomas replied calmly. "Sarah doesn't negotiate with threats. Never has." Before Mercer could respond, a new sequence activated throughout the farmhouse. The harsh white lighting suddenly cut out, plunging the room into complete darkness for precisely 3 seconds. Long enough to disorient, but not long. Enough for the intruders to adjust their positions. When illumination returned, it came from different sources and at reduced intensity, creating distinct shadows and visibility challenges for anyone not familiar with the layout. Simultaneously, a fine mist began to emerge from concealed nozzles. In the ceiling, not harmful but creating additional visual confusion and making footing subtly less secure on the hardwood floors. The combined effect was disorienting without being immediately incapacitating, a calculated measure designed to create tactical advantage while maintaining evidence collection. "Time expired," Sarah's voice announced with the same professional detachment, implementing containment protocols. The farmhouse's defensive systems had been designed by someone intimately familiar with both architecture-based security and human psychological response. The light levels continued to shift in patterns specifically calculated to disrupt visual acuity. The environmental controls adjusted to create subtle but effective discomfort. Most importantly, the acoustic systems began emitting frequencies calibrated to induce disorientation and reduce coordination without causing actual harm. From his seated position, Thomas observed the effects with clinical interest. The Scorpion Riders' cohesion as a unit began to deteriorate almost immediately. Their practiced tactical formation, already compromised by the unexpected resistance, now faltered completely as each man instinctively responded to the environmental manipulations according to his individual tolerance and training. Mercer, to his credit, recognized the sophisticated nature of what they were experiencing and attempted to rally his team. "Focus! It's just lights and noise. Maintain position and..." His command was interrupted by a new development, the simultaneous deployment of specialized restraint systems built into the seemingly ordinary furniture and fixtures. The rug beneath two of his men suddenly transformed, from passive floor covering to active entanglement material, wrapping around their legs with surprising force. The decorative light fixtures descended from the ceiling on barely visible cables, deploying circular restraints that captured the arms of another intruder before he could effectively react. Throughout this precisely choreographed security response, Thomas remained seated in his chair, untouched by the systems activating around him. The contrast was stark and intentional, a demonstration of the surgical precision with which the farmhouse defenses could discriminate between occupants. Outside, Jake's team continued their systematic containment of the Scorpion Riders' exterior. Forces employing non-lethal but highly effective measures to neutralize and secure each individual. The property that had appeared to be a vulnerable target had transformed into a comprehensive, tactical environment controlled by invisible but overwhelming opposition. "All exterior elements contained," Jake reported through the communication system. 20 subjects secured with non-lethal measures. Complete documentation of weapons, vehicles, and tactical equipment achieved. Evidence preservation protocols active. Inside the farmhouse, Mercer maintained his aim at Thomas despite the deteriorating situation around him. Two of his men were completely incapacitated by the restraint systems. A third was struggling against the disorienting environmental effects, and their tactical advantage had been comprehensively neutralized. "Whoever you are," Mercer called out, addressing the unseen Sarah, "you've made a serious mistake. The Scorpion Riders don't forgive, and we don't forget. Whatever happens here tonight, you've started something that won't end well for you." The response came not from the invisible speakers, but from Thomas himself, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had lived alongside tactical excellence for over 4 decades. "Mr. Mercer, I don't think you understand what's happening. This isn't the beginning of something. For the Scorpion Riders, this is the end." Viewer retention moment. The next part of this story demonstrates why you never underestimate decades. of elite military experience. Subscribe now to witness what happens when criminal intimidation meets Delta Force strategy. Mercer's expression hardened as he processed Thomas's statement, the implications of their situation becoming clearer with each passing second. Around him, his men were being systematically neutralized by security measures they couldn't even identify, let alone counter. The farmhouse that had appeared so vulnerable from outside had transformed into a tactical environment completely controlled by unseen opposition. You think some fancy security system and a few tricks will stop an organization like ours? Mercer demanded, the weapon in his hand still aimed at Thomas despite the tremor that had developed in his grip. A physiological response to the specialized acoustic measures still deploying throughout the room. We have connections in state, government, in law enforcement. Whatever happens here tonight gets buried. Thomas regarded Mercer with the calm assessment of someone who had spent decades living with one of the most tactically brilliant minds in special operations. Those connections are precisely why Sarah designed this operation the way she did. Everyone you mentioned is already implicated in the evidence package being assembled. As Thomas spoke, the tactical situation within the farmhouse continued to evolve. The remaining mobile Scorpion riders found themselves increasingly constrained by the environment itself. Furniture that shifted unexpectedly, flooring that became subtly unstable beneath aggressive movement, lighting that created visual confusion without impeding basic function. These weren't crude traps, but sophisticated measures designed to control behavior while maintaining complete documentation. All exterior subjects secured and evidence catalogued, came Jake's update through the communication system. Perimeter integrity maintained. Federal response team has acknowledged and is inbound. ETA 47 minutes. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear Sarah's calm direction of the operation from her remote command position. Her intimate knowledge of the farmhouse systems allowing her to respond to each development with precise countermeasures. For every attempt by Mercer's men to regain tactical advantage, there was an immediate and specifically calibrated response. When one man attempted to use furniture as cover, hidden mechanisms subtly adjusted its position to compromise his concealment without creating obvious movement. When another tried to establish visual signals with his teammates, lighting adjustments interrupted the communication without appearing deliberate. The psychological impact of these continuous, subtle interventions was devastating to their operational cohesion. Mr. Mercer, Thomas said, his voice remaining conversational despite the weapon still pointed at him. I'm curious about something. In your experience intimidating people, have you ever encountered someone who spent 22 years planning for exactly this type of situation? The question wasn't merely conversation. It was a calculated reminder of what they were facing, not panicked civilians, but methodical, experienced opposition. Mercer's eyes narrowed as he tried to maintain tactical focus despite the increasing environmental disorientation. Your wife's military background is impressive, he conceded. Adaptive, enough to acknowledge what was now obvious. But the Scorpion Rider's reach goes beyond what you're prepared for. We're not just some local gang. We have international connections, resources you can't imagine. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as though they were having a normal conversation, rather than a hostage negotiation. Sarah mentioned you might say something like that. She called it organization-level intimidation. trying to make your group seem larger and more powerful than the individuals present. Standard tactic for criminal enterprises trying to punch above their weight class. The casual, psychological deconstruction of his approach visibly unsettled Mercer, his expression flickering between rage and uncertainty. His remaining mobile men looked to him for direction, their confidence in his leadership visibly eroding as the tactical environment continued to degrade around them. Through his earpiece, Thomas heard Sarah's voice, calm and focused as she monitored the situation. Federal tactical team moving to secure the county road junction. Thomas, prepare for Phase 3 initiation. Primary target is becoming unstable. Implement verbal de-escalation protocol Delta. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, maintaining eye contact with Mercer while adjusting his posture to appear less threatening. When he spoke again, his tone had subtly changed, still confident but with a new note of professional respect that addressed Mercer as a rational actor rather than a criminal. "Mr. Mercer, we've reached a decision point," Thomas stated with calm authority. "The property is secured. Your men outside are in custody. Federal agents are already en route. The evidence package is comprehensive and being transmitted to multiple secure locations. Your tactical options have been systematically eliminated." The shift in approach was calculated to offer Mercer a path toward rational surrender rather than emotional escalation. A technique Sarah had developed during hostage negotiations in environments where maintaining the subject's perceived dignity often meant the difference between peaceful resolution and violent conclusion. "You're trained," Thomas continued, acknowledging Mercer's background with professional respect. "You can assess a tactical situation objectively. The scenario you planned for no longer exists. The question now is whether you make decisions based on reality or ego." Mercer's jaw tightened as he processed Thomas's words, the professional assessment cutting through the emotional response he had been building toward. Despite his criminal objectives, he was indeed trained enough to recognize when a tactical situation had become untenable. "What exactly are you offering?" he asked, weapon still raised but his tone shifting toward pragmatic calculation. "Secure federal custody," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Complete physical safety for you and your men. Legal representation from the moment you're processed. No local handling where your connections might create vulnerability for you." The offer was crafted with psychological precision, addressing Mercer's immediate concerns about physical safety while subtly reminding him that the corrupt local officials he relied on might actually become a liability once federal authorities were involved. It presented surrender not as defeat, but as strategic repositioning. Through the farmhouse speaker system, Sarah's voice joined the negotiation directly, her tone carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "Mr. Mercer, this is Major Sarah Whitaker, United States Army Special Operations, retired. I'm currently coordinating with federal tactical response teams who will arrive at this location in approximately 40 minutes. Before they arrive, you have an opportunity to ensure this situation concludes without further escalation." The direct introduction created a pivotal moment in the confrontation. Sarah was no longer an unseen presence, but a specific individual with verifiable credentials and obvious tactical control of the environment. The professional authority in her voice communicated volumes about both her experience and her confidence in the current situation. The evidence package already assembled includes documentation of your organization's activities across 3 counties, she continued, each word measured and precise. This includes connections to local law enforcement, financial transactions, through the Horizon Development Group, and coordinated intimidation operations against 7 property owners in the region. This information has been transmitted to secure federal repositories and cannot be recalled or suppressed. The methodical description of exactly what they had documented transformed Mercer's understanding of his situation. This wasn't merely a sophisticated home security system. It was a comprehensive counterintelligence operation that had apparently been monitoring his organization's activities well beyond the immediate confrontation. Your current tactical position is not salvageable, Sarah concluded with professional assessment rather than threat. However, your personal situation remains negotiable depending on the decisions you make in the next few minutes. The strategic brilliance of Sarah's approach became evident as Mercer visibly reassessed his options. By addressing him as a professional rather than a criminal, by acknowledging his tactical training while clearly demonstrating its inadequacy in the current situation, she had created a path toward de-escalation that allowed him to maintain a sense of agency despite his comprehensive defeat. Thomas watched the calculations play out across Mercer's face, recognizing the moment when pragmatism began to overcome ego. The weapon in Mercer's hand lowered slightly, not surrendered, but no longer aimed directly at Thomas's chest. "How do I know the local sheriff won't simply have us eliminated once we're in custody?" Mercer asked, his question revealing his most immediate concern about surrender. "Our organization has evidence about his operations that he can't afford to have exposed." The question confirmed Sarah's assessment of the situation and the corrupt relationships that had facilitated the Scorpion Riders' expansion into the region. Her response came with immediate confidence, reinforcing the impression that they had anticipated and prepared for every aspect of this confrontation. Federal agents from the Organized Crime Division are already securing the county line, she explained. Sheriff Daniels and Deputies Merrick and Collins have been detained based on evidence transmitted an hour ago. You will not enter local custody at any point. This new information visibly impacted not just Mercer, but his remaining mobile men, who exchanged glances that communicated their recalculating assessment of the situation. The corrupt local protection they had relied on was apparently already compromised, fundamentally altering their strategic position in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical confrontation. "You've been investigating us for some time," Mercer stated, recognition dawning in his expression. "Not specifically," Thomas replied with calm honesty. "Sarah has maintained intelligence gathering on regional criminal operations since we purchased this farm. Your organization's expansion into this area simply triggered protocols established years ago. The comprehensive nature of the evidence wasn't about you particularly, it's just how she approaches security." This casual revelation seemed to affect Mercer more than any direct threat could have. The idea that their careful criminal expansion had been documented not through targeted investigation, but as part of someone's routine security procedures, challenged his entire perception of their operational security. "Who exactly is your wife?" Mercer asked, genuine uncertainty replacing his earlier confidence. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Officially, she's a retired army officer who now grows prize-winning tomatoes and makes excellent pecan pie. Unofficially, she spent 2 decades planning and executing operations that never officially happened in places the United States was never officially present. The description, deliberately vague, yet implicitly clear to anyone with knowledge of special operations, completed Mercer's reassessment of their situation. His weapon lowered further, though he maintained his grip on it. And this whole setup, this was her retirement project? He asked, gesturing to the farmhouse's nearly invisible security measures with something approaching professional appreciation despite their circumstances. Thomas nodded. Sarah doesn't really know how to not be prepared. When we bought this place, she said a secure home was the best anniversary present I could give her. Most of these systems have been in place for over a decade, regularly updated whenever she learns about new techniques or technologies. This farm is probably better secured than some military installations. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear the team's continuous updates as they maintained containment of the Scorpion Riders' exterior forces, while documenting every aspect of their illegal operation. The evidence package was growing more comprehensive, by the minute encompassing not just the immediate attempted intimidation, but the broader criminal enterprise it represented. Federal Tactical Team has secured the county line checkpoint, Jake reported. Sheriff's Department vehicles attempted intervention, but were contained without incident. Federal custody protocols initiated for all local law enforcement personnel with identified connections to target organization. The operation was proceeding with textbook precision, exactly as Sarah had planned it. Each element of the response had been methodically prepared, from the non-lethal containment systems to the evidence documentation protocols to the coordination with federal authorities. What had appeared to be an easy intimidation operation against vulnerable elderly landowners had transformed into the systematic dismantling of a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for years. In the farmhouse, Mercer had reached the inevitable conclusion that his tactical position was unsalvageable. With deliberate movements that communicated professional acceptance rather than surrender, he carefully placed his weapon on the floor and stepped back, hands raised to shoulder height. "I'm making a tactical decision based on current circumstances," he announced, maintaining the language of professional assessment rather than defeat. "My men will comply with containment until federal authorities arrive." Thomas acknowledged the decision with a respectful nod, recognizing it as the rational choice of someone trained to evaluate situations objectively, despite personal preferences. Through his earpiece, he could hear Sarah's voice directing the final phase of the operation. "Acknowledged," she responded, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "Initiate Phase 3, full containment and evidence preservation until federal handoff." Throughout the farmhouse, specialized restraint systems, deployed with synchronized precision, securing Mercer and his remaining mobile men without unnecessary force or risk. The environmental measures that had created disorientation gradually normalized, returning the lighting and acoustic properties to standard conditions that would facilitate proper documentation and eventual testimony. As the situation stabilized, Thomas finally rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose arthritic joints had been stressed by prolonged stillness. Despite the high-tech security system surrounding him, he was still a 72-year-old farmer. whose body reminded him of that fact regardless of circumstances. "Mr. Mercer," he said as he straightened to his full height, "I believe we'll be having our discussion after all, just not about selling our farm." The storm continued to rage outside the farmhouse, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the Texas landscape. Inside, however, a different kind of storm had been contained. The Scorpion riders who had arrived with such confidence now sat secured by specialized restraint systems, their weapons catalogued as evidence, their communications devices disabled. What had begun as a simple intimidation operation had transformed into the most comprehensive defeat their organization had ever experienced. Thomas moved through the farmhouse with unhurried purpose, checking systems and confirming security protocols. As he maintained communication with the team through his earpiece, the transformation in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the performance of vulnerable elderly farmer, replaced by the quiet competence of someone who had spent decades partnered with an elite tactical operator. "Status update. On federal response," he requested, his voice calm and focused. Emily's voice responded immediately through the communication system. "Federal tactical team has established secure perimeter at the county line. Evidence transmission is 93% complete. Transport vehicles for secured subjects are en route with estimated arrival in 22 minutes. The farm's sophisticated communication system had allowed Sarah to coordinate directly with federal authorities from her remote command position, transmitting real-time evidence and tactical information that had activated multiple federal response protocols. The comprehensive nature of the evidence package, including documentation of the Scorpion Riders' connections to local law enforcement and government officials, had elevated the response beyond standard procedure. "Sarah, do you want me to prepare the additional documentation from the study?" Thomas asked, knowing his wife would be monitoring all communications. "Affirmative," her voice replied through the system. "The financial records and property documentation will complete the package. Federal prosecutors are particularly interested in the connection between Horizon Development and the offshore accounts we identified. Mercer, still secured by the farmhouse's restraint systems, but able to hear the conversation, watched with increasing comprehension as the full scope of their defeat became apparent. The realization that spread across his face wasn't just about the immediate tactical failure, but about the systematic dismantling of an organization he had believed was protected by corruption and intimidation. "You've been building a RICO case," he stated flatly, professional recognition overcoming personal concern as the pattern became clear. "This wasn't just about protecting your farm. You've been documenting our entire operation." Thomas glanced at him with calm acknowledgement as he moved toward the study. "Sarah doesn't believe in half measures. When your organization first appeared in the region 18 months ago, she recognized the pattern from similar operations she'd encountered during her career. The systematic property acquisitions through front companies, the gradual corruption of local officials, the strategic positioning along county lines to complicate jurisdiction, the casual revelation that their carefully constructed criminal expansion had been identified and documented from its earliest stages, seemed to affect Mercer more than the immediate tactical defeat. His expression shifted from professional calculation to something approaching genuine concern. "How much does she know?" he asked, the question revealing his new priority, understanding the extent of the organizational compromise rather than his personal situation. Thomas paused at the study doorway. Sarah spent 2 decades identifying, infiltrating, and dismantling organizations that were better funded, better trained, and more dangerous than yours, Mr. Mercer. She approaches civilian security with the same thoroughness she applied to national security. I would assume she knows everything worth knowing about your operation. In the study, Thomas unlocked a hidden compartment built into what appeared to be an antique writing desk. Inside was a secure digital storage device containing years of methodically organized intelligence on regional criminal activities, financial records, property transactions, personnel movements, and communication patterns that Sarah had compiled, with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her military career. As he retrieved the device, Thomas could hear Jake's voice updating the team on exterior security. All subjects remain contained. Weather conditions have degraded but are not affecting operational parameters. Surveillance confirms no additional Scorpion Riders forces approaching the area. The comprehensive nature of their preparation continued to reveal itself in every aspect of the operation. Despite the severe storm, backup power systems maintained all security measures at full capacity. Redundant communication networks ensured uninterrupted coordination with federal authorities. Even the weather, which might have compromised conventional security operations, had been accounted for in Sarah's planning. When Thomas returned to the main room, he found Mercer studying him with new intensity, his initial dismissal of the elderly farmer completely replaced by wary respect. "You were military too," Mercer observed, the statement carrying the certainty of professional recognition. Thomas shook his head as he settled back into his chair, the secure digital device safely stored in his pocket for transfer to federal authorities. "Never served a day. I was a pecan farmer when I met Sarah, still am now. Everything I know about tactics and security came from 43 years of marriage to someone who thinks about those things the way most people think about grocery lists." The idea seemed to genuinely surprise Mercer, that someone without formal training could have maintained such calm and effective performance throughout a high-stress tactical situation. His reassessment of Thomas was visible in his expression, professional respect reluctantly replacing his earlier dismissal. "You let us underestimate you," he stated, understanding dawning. The shotgun with the missing firing pin, the old farmer act, the apparent vulnerability, it was all calculated to draw us in. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the observation without pride or satisfaction. Sarah calls it tactical humility, the advantage gained by allowing opponents to underestimate your capabilities and preparation. She spent her whole life being underestimated because she's a woman. Taught me how powerful it can be when people dismiss you based on appearances. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear the team continuing their methodical processing of the contained Scorpion Riders forces. Each individual was being documented with military precision, photographs, fingerprints, personal effects catalogued, and connections to specific criminal activities noted for the eventual prosecution. Nothing was being left to chance or incomplete documentation. Federal Tactical Team reports they've secured 3 additional Scorpion Riders at their secondary staging area. Emily updated. Documentation of telecommunications indicates they were monitoring the operation and became concerned when communication was lost with the primary team. This new information confirmed Sarah's prediction that the Scorpion Riders would establish multiple fallback positions, another aspect of their operation that she had anticipated and prepared for. Her understanding of how criminal organizations structured their operations had allowed her to predict behavior patterns that the organization itself believed were unpredictable. "Your wife," Mercer said, his tone shifting to reluctant professional admiration, "she isn't just former military, is she? This level of operational planning, the comprehensive intelligence gathering, the psychological warfare elements, this is beyond standard military protocol." Thomas regarded Mercer thoughtfully, considering how much to reveal. Sarah had always preferred operational security over disclosure, but in this case, a certain level of clarity might serve their longer-term objectives. Sarah commanded specialized units tasked with identifying, infiltrating, and neutralizing non-standard threat organizations in environments where conventional military operations weren't possible, he finally explained, the deliberately vague description nonetheless conveying the elite nature of her service. She approached those operations the same way she approaches everything, with meticulous planning, comprehensive intelligence gathering, and multiple contingency protocols. The explanation, while limited in specific details, provided enough context for Mercer to understand the nature of his miscalculation. The organization that had succeeded through intimidation and violence against untrained civilians had unknowingly targeted someone with decades of experience, neutralizing far more dangerous opponents. "We never stood a chance," Mercer realized. The statement carrying no self-pity, but rather professional assessment. "From the moment we selected this property, we were walking into an operation designed to dismantle our entire organization." Thomas considered the statement with the careful thought he applied to most things. "I wouldn't say it was designed specifically for you. Sarah creates security protocols as naturally as she breathes. This farm has been prepared to respond to threats since the day we purchased it. Your organization simply triggered systems that were already in place." This perspective seemed to affect Mercer more than any direct confrontation could have. The realization that their defeat hadn't required special attention or extraordinary measures, just the routine security preparations of someone who approached civilian life with the same thoroughness she had applied to special operations. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the thunder growing more distant as the rain lightened to a steady drizzle. Through his earpiece, Thomas could hear the approaching federal vehicles, their arrival imminent as the operation transitioned from containment to formal custody. "Thomas!" Sarah's voice came through the communication system, now addressing him directly rather than through his earpiece. "Federal custody transfer will begin in approximately 5 minutes. I'm returning to the property now." A ripple of renewed attention moved through the secured Scorpion riders at the announcement. Despite their comprehensive defeat, there remained a curiosity about the woman who had orchestrated their downfall from a remote position, neutralizing their organization without ever directly engaging them. "You're actually going to meet the legendary Sarah," Thomas commented to Mercer with a small smile. "Consider yourself fortunate. Most of the people who have found themselves on the wrong side of her operations never had that opportunity." The statement wasn't meant as intimidation, but as simple fact, and Mercer seemed to take it as such, his expression reflecting professional curiosity rather than personal concern. Whatever happened to him legally from this point forward, he had clearly developed a reluctant respect for the operation that had defeated him. The distant sound of vehicles approaching along the rain-soaked driveway announced the arrival of federal authorities, Through the farmhouse windows, the flashing lights of tactical vehicles became visible, their approach methodical and coordinated as they established a secure perimeter around the property. "Standard federal protocol," Thomas observed, recognizing the tactical formation from the drills Sarah had discussed with him over the years. "They'll establish full perimeter security before initiating custody transfer. You can expect professional treatment, Mr. Mercer." Sarah was very specific about ensuring everything was by the book. Mercer nodded in acknowledgement, his posture reflecting acceptance of the inevitable rather than continued resistance. The professional part of him seemed to appreciate the methodical precision with which his operation had been dismantled, even as the criminal leader in him processed the implications for his organization and his future. As federal agents in tactical gear began to approach the farmhouse, Thomas activated the protocol to disengage the property's specialized security measures. The restraint systems maintaining control of Mercer and his men remained active, but the environmental measures and defensive protocols gradually returned to standby status, creating a normal operational environment for the federal team. "Security systems transitioning to federal protocol," Thomas confirmed through the communication system. "Ready for custody transfer on your mark, Sarah." The calm authority in his voice belied his lack of formal training, demonstrating how completely he had internalized the operational discipline that characterized his wife's approach to security. After decades of marriage to someone who approached everyday life with the structured precision of a special operations commander, Thomas had absorbed those same patterns into his own behavior. The first federal agents reached the porch, their approach professional but not aggressive, as they established visual confirmation of the situation inside. Their communication patterns and tactical positioning reflected standard protocol for a secured scene rather than an active threat environment. Another indication that Sarah had thoroughly briefed them on the status of the operation. "Mr. Whitaker?" The lead agent called through the door, his voice carrying the formal authority of federal service. "This is Special Agent Ramirez with the FBI. We're here to take custody of the secured subjects and evidence." Thomas rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of someone whose arthritis reminded him of his actual age, regardless of the adrenaline still present in his system. The tactical situation was fully resolved now, the transition to legal process beginning as they had planned. "The door is unlocked, Agent Ramirez," he called back. "All subjects are secured and documented. Evidence packages are prepared for transfer." As the federal agents entered the farmhouse, their professional assessment of the scene was evident. In their expressions, the sophisticated restraint systems securing the Scorpion riders, the comprehensive documentation visible on monitoring systems, and the organized evidence preparation all spoke to an operation far more professional than they had expected from a civilian response. "Mrs. Whitaker briefed us on the situation," Agent Ramirez commented, his tone carrying carefully neutral professionalism as he surveyed the scene. "I understand she's en route to the property now." Thomas nodded, handing over the secure digital device from his pocket. "This contains the complete intelligence package on the Scorpion Riders' regional operations, including financial documentation connecting Horizon Development Group to their criminal activities. Sarah will provide the authentication protocols when she arrives." The subtle shift in the agent's expression revealed his adjustment to the situation, recognition that he was dealing not with a typical civilian victim, but with someone operating with professional precision, despite his appearance as an elderly farmer. It was a reaction Thomas had seen countless times when people first realized that Sarah's influence extended far beyond her immediate presence. "We'll begin processing the subjects for transport," Ramirez stated, gesturing to his team to initiate the custody transfer procedures. "Your wife indicated there are 26 individuals in total. 23 on the property, 3 at the secondary staging area, and 4 compromised local law enforcement personnel," Thomas confirmed with the casual precision of someone reading a grocery list rather than cataloging captured criminals. Complete documentation of weapons, vehicles, and communication equipment is included in the digital package. As the federal agents began the methodical process of taking custody of the secured Scorpion riders, Thomas could hear a familiar vehicle approaching along the driveway. The distinctive sound of Sarah's Jeep, with the minor timing irregularity in the engine that she'd never bothered to fix, announced her return to the property she had defended so effectively from a distance. Thomas moved to the porch, watching as headlights cut through the dissipating rain. After 43 years of marriage, the sight of his wife returning home still brought a sense of completion that transcended the extraordinary circumstances of the evening. Regardless of the tactical operation that had just concluded, or the federal agents now processing criminals in their living room, his primary reaction was simply the satisfaction of knowing Sarah was safely home. The Jeep came to a stop near the porch, and Sarah Whitaker emerged with the fluid economy of movement that characterized everything she did. At 68, her silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, and her posture still carrying the disciplined straightness of her military years, she presented a striking figure, not because of any attempt at imposing presence, but because of the natural authority that had defined her through decades of command. Her eyes found Thomas immediately, a private smile passing between them that contained volumes of shared understanding before her focus shifted to the tactical situation, still resolving around them. The transition from wife to commander was subtle but unmistakable. A slight squaring of her shoulders, a focusing of her gaze, an adjustment in her posture that signaled her shift into operational mode. As Sarah climbed the porch steps to join, her husband, Mercer, watched through the farmhouse window, finally seeing the architect of his organization's most comprehensive defeat. Whatever he had expected, perhaps someone whose physical presence matched the tactical brilliance he had experienced, the reality seemed to both confirm and challenge his assumptions. The distinction between active and passive monitoring was delivered with such casual precision that it took Mercer a moment to process the implications. The organization he had believed was operating with effective secrecy had apparently been documented from its first expansion into the region, catalogued as a potential threat long before it had taken any direct action against the Whitakers. "You identified us based on property acquisition patterns," he asked, professional assessment temporarily overriding his personal circumstances. Sarah moved further into the room, her posture relaxed, but her awareness encompassing every detail of the ongoing federal operation in her home. Property acquisitions, along jurisdictional boundaries, strategic cultivation of local officials, systematic pressure on isolated landowners. It's a pattern I've observed in various contexts throughout my career. Criminal organizations and hostile state actors often use similar approaches when establishing operational footholds. The casual comparison between his criminal enterprise and nation-state intelligence operations carried no insult but simply professional assessment. It was this clinical detachment that seemed to affect Mercer most. The realization that his organization's activities had been categorized, analyzed, and countered not through emotional response, but through methodical operational protocols. Thomas watched the interaction with quiet appreciation for his wife's approach. Where others might have displayed anger or vindictiveness towards someone who had threatened their home and spouse, Sarah engaged with professional precision, focused on effective resolution rather than emotional satisfaction. The financial documentation, Mercer continued, his tone shifting toward reluctant professional respect. How did you penetrate our corporate structure? Those shells were established through law firms specializing in privacy protection. Sarah's slight smile contained no mockery, only the measured acknowledgement of professional craft. Mr. Mercer, I spent decades tracking financial support networks for organizations with resources far beyond yours and legal protections more sophisticated than corporate shells. Horizon development structure was actually quite conventional once you recognize the pattern. As federal agents continued processing the secured Scorpion riders for transport, Sarah moved to join Thomas near the kitchen doorway. Her hand briefly touched his, a private gesture of connection that contained more genuine emotion than anything she had displayed toward the intruders. The contrast between her professional detachment with operational matters and the quiet warmth she shared with her husband was striking. You should have Agent Chen examine the documentation on the offshore accounts, she advised Ramirez seamlessly, returning to operational focus. There are connections to 3 other criminal organizations operating in the Southwest that weren't part of our immediate concern, but may be relevant to ongoing federal investigations. The casual revelation that her intelligence gathering had identified criminal connections beyond the immediate threat to their property demonstrated the comprehensive nature of Sarah's security protocols. She hadn't merely documented the specific organization threatening their farm. She had mapped the entire regional criminal ecosystem as a matter of standard procedure. We'll ensure that information reaches the appropriate task forces, Ramirez confirmed, making a specific note in his documentation. The Organized Crime Division will be particularly interested in those connections. Throughout this exchange, the team that had helped implement Sarah's defensive plan continued their systematic shutdown of the specialized security measures around the property. Emily coordinated the transition of surveillance systems to standard recording modes. Jake supervised the deactivation of the containment measures in the orchard. Marcus and the others maintained perimeter security, while federal agents completed their processing of the captured Scorpion riders. Their quiet laughter, shared in this moment of private understanding, reflected the extraordinary partnership they had built. One where tactical operations against criminal organizations could be discussed with the same comfortable familiarity as garden plans or dinner preparations. You think they'll be back? Thomas asked, the question addressing not just the Scorpion riders, but the broader implications of the night's events. Sarah considered this with her usual thoughtful precision. Not them specifically. The federal case will be comprehensive, particularly with the evidence connecting them to corrupted local officials. But other organizations may eventually test the boundaries if this region remains strategically valuable to their operations. Thomas nodded, unsurprised by her assessment. And we'll be ready if they do. It wasn't a question, but a statement of calm certainty, reflecting their shared approach to life's challenges. neither fearful anticipation nor reckless confidence, but simply realistic preparation for whatever might come. Sarah's gaze moved across their property, taking in the pecan orchard silvered by moonlight now breaking through the dissipating clouds, the greenhouse where her prized tomatoes grew, the barn and outbuildings that concealed sophisticated security systems alongside ordinary farm equipment. This land represented not just their home, but the life they had built together. He contributing his knowledge of growing things, she her expertise in protecting what matters. "I'm thinking of expanding the eastern irrigation system," she commented, her mind already considering improvements to their security infrastructure. Tonight's approach indicated a potential vulnerability in our coverage that should be addressed. Thomas smiled at this characteristic response, Sarah's way of processing the evening's events, not through emotional reflection, but through practical assessment and improvement. "We could integrate it with the new drip system for the younger. Trees. No one would question additional water access in this climate." Their conversation, transitioning seamlessly from tactical operation to agricultural planning, captured the essence of their extraordinary partnership. The sophisticated security systems were woven into the genuine farm operations, just as Sarah's tactical brilliance had integrated with Thomas's agricultural expertise to create something neither could have achieved alone. As they turned to re-enter their home, Sarah paused, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, the words containing depths of meaning beyond their ordinary usage. Thomas understood everything conveyed in those two words. Gratitude for his steady presence during the operation, appreciation for the partnership they had built, acknowledgement of the extraordinary life they had created together. After 43 years of marriage, they had developed a private language where the most profound communications often required the fewest words. "Always," he replied with equal simplicity, the single word carrying his enduring commitment to their shared life, regardless of what challenges it might bring. Together they entered their farmhouse, closing the door on the extraordinary events of the night and returning to the rhythm of their life together, a life that somehow managed to encompass both pecan farming and tactical operations against criminal organizations with equal naturalness. The Scorpion Riders had made a critical error in targeting the Whitaker farm, mistaking physical age for vulnerability and rural simplicity for lack of sophistication. In doing so, they had learned a lesson that others had discovered throughout Sarah Whitaker's long career, that sometimes the most formidable opponent is the one you never recognized as a threat until it was too late. If this story of hidden strength and tactical brilliance resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We bring you these powerful tales of extraordinary people who prove that appearances can be deceiving and true capability often lies beneath the surface. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Tomorrow, we're sharing something special. An inside look at how elite operators think when facing overwhelming odds, with insights you can apply to your own life challenges. Our community loves these stories of unexpected strength and strategic thinking. Join us by commenting where you're watching from and what part of this story spoke to you most. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful narratives to life. Remember, in a world that often judges by appearance, the most formidable strength is the kind no one sees coming until it's too late. Subscribe now and become part. of our growing community of viewers who appreciate the power of preparation, experience, and tactical thinking.